What an immense joy, what a true privilege it is to share this space with all of you. A space that isn't just physical but a nexus for ideas, a sanctuary for reflection, and, I hope, a catalyst for discovery. Today I would like to begin our conversation with a question posed to me a while ago by a good friend, a person we'll call Hermogenes. During one of those profound conversations that life sometimes gifts us, he leaned in, and with the look of someone who has wrestled deeply with a thought, he said to me, "Mario, tell me something. Is it wise? Is it ever truly sensible to show our vulnerability? Should we really allow others to see our cracks, our flaws, those parts of ourselves we don't consider perfect?" It's an extraordinary question. No matter where you live or the culture you were raised in, you have likely felt the same pressure that most of us feel. The pressure to be strong. The pressure to be competent. The pressure to have everything under control. We live in a society that worships the image of invulnerability. From a very young age, we learn to construct masks. We have a mask for work, where we are the efficient professional, the decisive leader. We have another for our social lives, where we are the witty friend, the eloquent conversationalist. Sometimes we even wear a mask for our own family. And most tragically of all, sometimes we wear a mask even when we are utterly alone. Why do we do this? Why this titanic effort to hide what we truly feel, what we fear, our insecurities? The answer, as it so often does, lies in the wisdom of our own bodies. Deep within our brain, in the limbic system, we have a tiny ancient structure the size of an almond. It's the amygdala. I like to imagine it as a sentinel, a soldier standing guard at the gates of our survival. This sentinel is not sophisticated. It doesn't understand nuance. It isn't interested in whether we are happy or fulfilled. This sentinel has only one obsession, a single question it repeats endlessly. Am I safe or am I in danger? And in the ancient world where this sentinel was designed, being vulnerable was synonymous with danger. If the group saw you as weak, if you showed a flaw, you risked being excluded. And on the African savanna, exclusion from the group was literally a death sentence. So, when today, thousands of years later, we consider showing our vulnerability, admitting a mistake at work, confessing a fear to a friend, saying, "I don't know," or "I need help," that ancient sentinel, our amygdala, sounds the alarm. Danger. Danger. If they see you are weak, they will attack you. If they see your weakness, they will exploit it. They will reject you. You will be left alone. And what do we do to calm this sentinel? We build walls. We build high, thick walls around our hearts, around our true selves. We honestly believe that these walls protect us. We believe they keep us safe from judgment, from rejection, from pain. But this is the great paradox of our human condition, a paradox my friend Hermogenes would discover the hard way. The very walls we build to protect ourselves eventually become our prison. The story of Hermogenes, which he has generously allowed me to share, is the journey of a man who lived inside that prison, believing it was a palace. Seen from the outside, Hermogenes was the epitome of success. He had what our society applauds: a high-level management position of enormous responsibility in a multinational corporation. He was brilliant, sharp, and respected. He had a family that seemed to be straight out of a magazine, a beautiful house. In short, he had everything you were supposed to have. From the outside, his life was impressive. But on the inside, Hermogenes was waging a silent battle. The pressure to maintain that image of perfection, of absolute control, was suffocating him. The mask had become so fused to his skin that he no longer knew where the character ended and the man began. He felt a growing emptiness, a dull anxiety he tried to soothe with more work, more success, reinforcing the walls of his gilded cage. He was afraid, deeply afraid, that if anyone peeked behind the curtain, if anyone discovered the cracks, his entire world would crumble. And our bodies, our minds, possess an infinite wisdom. When we ignore their whispers for too long, the whisper of exhaustion, the whisper of sadness, the whisper of meaninglessness, they have no choice but to begin to shout. And the shout in Hermogenes' life was not a gentle cry, it was an explosion. Hermogenes suffered a breakdown, a severe mental illness. We are not talking about simple stress. We are talking about the total collapse of the structure he had so painstakingly built. The man who controlled everything suddenly controlled nothing, not even his own thoughts. His brain, the very tool that had carried him to the top, had turned against him. The situation was so dire that it required hospitalization. Imagine the scene: the once invulnerable pillar of strength, now lying in a hospital bed, cut off from the world, struggling to find a flicker of himself in the fog of his own mind. He was at the peak of vulnerability a human being can experience. And it was there, in that moment of absolute helplessness, that the world he had built, the world of having, finally shattered. The first blow came from his company, the place to which he had dedicated decades of his life, his talent, his energy. What did they do? They didn't call to say, "Hermogenes, take your time, we'll wait for you, get well." No. What he received was a legal notice. They fired him. They terminated his contract. In his weakest moment, the structure he had helped build turned its back on him and cast him aside. Imagine the impact, the feeling of injustice. But the earthquake wasn't over. The most devastating aftershock was yet to come. His family. His wife, perhaps overwhelmed by the situation, by fear, by the inability to comprehend what was happening, decided she couldn't go on. She took the children and left. In the span of a few weeks, Hermogenes lost absolutely everything. He lost his mental health. He lost his job, his professional identity. He lost his family, his home, his emotional core. He told me that in those days in the hospital, the pain was unbearable. But there was something worse than the pain. It was the injustice, the feeling of being treated in an atrocious, inhuman way. The feeling of abandonment, a lack of affection and compassion that crushed his soul. And here biology enters the scene once again. What happens when we feel attacked, betrayed, when our life is in physical or emotional danger? The sentinel, the amygdala, doesn't just ring the alarm bell, it hijacks the ship. This is what we call an amygdala hijack. At that moment, the captain of the ship, our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that reasons, plans, sees perspective, and manages emotions, is completely disconnected. The amygdala takes command because survival is all that matters. Hermogenes' body became a chemical battlefield. He was literally flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, the hormones of stress, of the fight or flight response. The problem was Hermogenes couldn't fight. He was in a hospital bed. And he couldn't flee. He was trapped in his own mind. He was trapped in a biological prison. His body was in constant survival mode, and in that state the world shrinks. There is no future, no past, only a threatening present. There is no logic, only reaction. And it was here that Hermogenes confessed something fascinating to me, something profoundly human. He said, "Mario, do you know what kept me alive during those dark days? Do you know what gave me the strength to get out of that bed?" I was expecting him to say hope, the memory of his children, a spiritual awakening. But he looked at me, his eyes fixed on mine, and said, "It was rage. Pure rage." He told me, "I felt like the Count of Monte Cristo. I felt betrayed, unjustly thrown into a dungeon. And I swore in that hospital bed that I would get out of there, I would recover, and I would have my revenge. I would take back what was mine, and those who had done this to me would pay." This, which may sound shocking, has a flawless biological logic. Deep depression, absolute hopelessness, is a state of deactivation. There is no energy, no movement, it's a vital shutdown. Anger, on the other hand, is an emotion of extremely high activation. It's pure adrenaline, it's energy that mobilizes. In Hermogenes' case, anger was fuel. A dirty, toxic fuel, perhaps, but fuel nonetheless. It gave him a purpose. It gave him a reason to fight, to focus, to claw his way out of the pit. And Hermogenes fought. Driven by that dark energy, he focused on his recovery. And slowly, with a titanic effort, he left the hospital, regained control of his mind, and became functional again. He had survived. He had emerged from the physical confinement of the hospital. But, and this is the key to everything we will talk about today, was he free? Hermogenes had left one prison only to enter another, one far more subtle, invisible, but infinitely more resilient, the prison of resentment. He thought he was fighting for justice, but in reality he was chained. Because when you live with anger, when you live with resentment, when you live for revenge, you are not free. You are bound by unbreakable chains to those who harmed you. Neurologically, Hermogenes was no longer in the hospital, but his brain didn't know it. He kept reliving the betrayal, the injustice, the abandonment over and over again. The people who had hurt him weren't physically with him, but they lived inside his head. They had breakfast with him, they showered with him, they went to sleep with him every night. Every thought was a judgment, every memory an open wound. Biologically, his body was still at war. That sentinel, the amygdala, remained on high alert. His cortisol levels remained chronically elevated. And here we discover one of the great truths of medicine. We cannot heal in a threatening environment. The body cannot be in fight mode and regeneration mode at the same time. It's impossible. You either defend yourself from the tiger or you digest your food and repair your tissues. You have to choose. And Hermogenes' body continued to choose to fight. He was consuming his own life force in a war that existed only inside of him. He had survived, yes, but he was not living. He was profoundly imprisoned, a prisoner of his past, a prisoner of his story, a prisoner of his own haywire biology. He had not yet discovered the most liberating truth of his life, the truth that gives this talk its title, a truth that would still cost him so much pain to understand. Until he forgave, he would not be free. But at that moment he was a long way from freedom. He was in the dungeon of the Count of Monte Cristo, sharpening his daggers, unaware that the only person he was cutting day after day was himself. So, we left Hermogenes having escaped the hospital only to enter the prison of resentment. He was alive, but he wasn't truly living. The anger that had fueled his survival was now the poison that was consuming him. There is a powerful metaphor that illustrates this state perfectly. It is said that living with resentment is like holding a burning coal in your hand with the intention of throwing it at the person who has hurt you. Who gets burned first? Who gets burned the entire time they are holding that coal? Always, inevitably, it is you. That burning coal is not a poetic metaphor, it is a biological description. That coal is chronic cortisol, the stress hormone which, when sustained over time, literally burns our body from the inside out. It causes inflammation. As a surgeon, I have seen what chronic inflammation does to the body. It damages arteries, overloads the heart, and weakens our immune system. Hermogenes was literally burning alive. His body was still in a state of war. And in war there is no space for creation, no space for repair, only destruction. He began to realize that this desire for revenge, this need for justice, had become his jailer. He was chained, and the irony was that the chains were not held by his former bosses or his ex-wife. He was holding the chains himself. And this is where we encounter the most difficult, most misunderstood, and yet most powerful word in our emotional vocabulary: forgiveness. When Hermogenes first began to explore this idea, his initial reaction was one of absolute rejection. Forgive? Forgive the people who had destroyed his life? Forgive those who had fired him while he lay in a hospital bed? Forgive the abandonment? It sounded like weakness. It sounded like surrender. It sounded like injustice. And this is the first great misunderstanding we all have about forgiveness. We believe that forgiving is an act of generosity toward the other person. We think it's a gift we give to the offender. But true forgiveness, the deep, liberating kind, has nothing to do with the other person. It is an act of pure self-preservation. It is the gift you give to yourself. Let's redefine forgiveness from the perspective of science and reason. First, what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not forgetting. The brain is designed to remember what has caused us pain. That sentinel, the amygdala, makes sure to burn threats into our memory to protect us in the future. Forgetting is not only difficult, it's probably unwise. Forgiveness is not justifying or excusing the other person's behavior. It does not mean saying, what you did was okay. No. What was wrong remains wrong. The truth is not negotiable. Forgiveness is not necessarily reconciliation. You can forgive someone and, for the sake of your own mental health, decide that person should never be a part of your life again. And most importantly, forgiveness is not a feeling. It is a mistake to wait until you feel like forgiving. That feeling may never come. So, if it is none of those things, what is forgiveness? Forgiveness is a decision. It is a conscious, deliberate act of will. It is the moment when you, from your center of power, your inner captain, decide that you will no longer allow a past event to dictate your present and destroy your future. Forgiveness is literally taking the scissors and cutting the emotional and biological chain that binds you to your offender. It's reclaiming your power. It is saying, "You hurt me once. I will not allow you to keep hurting me every single day of my life with my own memories." It is letting go of the burning coal. And this decision, this act of will, has the astonishing power to change the physical structure of our brain. This is where we encounter the most hopeful concept in modern neuroscience: neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is simply the scientific evidence that our brain is not a fixed structure but is malleable. It changes with every thought we have, with every decision we make. You see, when Hermogenes lived in resentment, he was constantly activating a specific neural circuit. Think of it as a path in a forest. The first time he thought about the injustice, it was like hacking that path with a machete. The second time it was easier. After 1,000 times, that path was no longer a path, it was a 6-lane highway. His brain, for sheer efficiency, went straight there. The neural groove of resentment was deep. His brain was physically wired for anger, for victimhood, for pain. And what is forgiveness in neuroplastic terms? Forgiveness is the conscious decision to stop using that highway. It is the courageous act of our prefrontal cortex, the captain of the ship, the seat of our reason, values, and will, finally looking at the sentinel, at the amygdala, and calmly saying, "I hear you. Thank you for trying to protect me. Thank you for reminding me of the danger. But that threat is over. The event is finished. Right now, in this moment, I am safe. And because I am safe, I am consciously choosing not to take that highway. I am choosing to start building a new path." At the beginning, that new path is difficult. It's like taking out the machete again and starting to cut through the weeds in a different direction. The new path can be called peace, it can be called the present, it can be called acceptance. And this is where Hermogenes began his real work. It wasn't an overnight miracle. It wasn't like flipping a switch. It was a daily practice. He would wake up in the morning and the first thought to assault his mind would be the highway, the image of his boss, the dismissal letter. His body would tense, his cortisol would begin to rise, and he would consciously breathe and say, "No. I choose not to go down that road. I choose to focus on this ray of sunlight coming through the window. I choose to be grateful that I can breathe." He chose the new path. He had to forgive thousands of times, hundreds of times a day. He started with the easier part. He decided to forgive his company. It was a long process. He had to understand that remaining tied to them by hatred was, in essence, giving them power over his future, allowing them to fire him not just once but every day of his life. By forgiving them, by releasing that chain, he wasn't absolving them. He was freeing himself to look for a new job, a new purpose, without carrying that burden. And then came the hardest part, forgiving his ex-wife. Here, the pain was deeper because it was intertwined with love and with his children. The path of anger was so tempting. But he realized something crucial. She had probably also acted from a place of fear, panic, and incomprehension. He didn't justify it, but it allowed him to see it from a different perspective. And most importantly, he realized that his resentment toward her was poisoning the air his children breathed. He understood that if he wanted to have a healthy relationship with them, he couldn't use them as weapons in a war. And so, out of love for his children and out of love for himself, he decided to let go of the burning coal. He decided to forgive, not for her but for them and for himself. And one day it happened. It wasn't a choir of angels or a burst of fireworks. It was something much more subtle and much more profound. He was out for a walk and suddenly realized he hadn't thought about the injustice all morning. He realized he was at peace. He felt a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. It was a feeling of physiological relief. At that moment, without him even knowing it, his biology was changing. The sentinel, the amygdala, for the first time in years, had lowered its guard. The level of cortisol in his blood dropped. And when cortisol decreases, the body can finally emerge from its state of war. The parasympathetic nervous system could activate. His immune system, freed from the tyranny of stress, could finally begin to do its job. To repair, to regenerate, to heal. His brain, freed from the amygdala's hijack, began to allow the entry of other neurochemicals. Serotonin, the molecule of well-being, oxytocin, the molecule of connection and trust. Through that sustained act of will, over time Hermogenes had changed the chemistry of his brain. He had weakened the highway of resentment and built a new neural road to peace. He had regained control of his own mind. He had severed the chains that bound him to the past. He was finally free. Or almost free. Because he had achieved the impossible. He had forgiven those who had done him terrible harm. But on his journey he encountered one last jailer, a jailer far more cunning, far more intimate. He had forgiven others, but the question still hung in the air. Had he forgiven himself? And so, Hermogenes had achieved a measure of freedom. He had cut the chains to his past, released the burning coal that was searing his hands. He had forgiven others. He was free, or so he thought. Because when the storm outside dissipated, when the noise of the battle against his enemies fell silent, he began to hear a whisper. A whisper that, in the stillness of his newfound peace, slowly grew into a voice far harsher, far more ruthless than that of his former boss or his ex-wife. It was the voice of his own judgment. He had met the final jailer, the most cunning of all, himself. Hermogenes described it to me this way: Mario, I thought the hardest part was forgiving them. How wrong I was. I realized that deep down I despised myself. I blamed myself. I felt like a failure. His internal dialogue was devastating. You failed, that voice told him. How could you let this happen to you? You were weak. You collapsed. A real man doesn't break down like that. You failed your family. You failed your career. You are a failure. This is the inner judge. We all have one. And it's a judge that delivers a sentence without appeal, who works 24 hours a day, and who knows all our weaknesses. Biologically, this inner judge keeps the amygdala, that sentinel, active. Because when you are attacking yourself, guess what? You are still in danger. The enemy is no longer outside. The enemy is within. The body doesn't distinguish between a physical predator and a fierce, self-critical thought. To the body they are equally threatening. The cortisol kept flowing. Hermogenes had freed himself from others but remained chained to the worst version of himself. He was still trapped in guilt for what he had done and shame for who he thought he was. And this is where he had to learn the most difficult lesson of all, the one that takes us to the very heart of healing. He had to discover self-compassion. Now be careful. This term, self-compassion, is often deeply misunderstood. Our culture, obsessed with performance and harshness, confuses it with self-indulgence, self-pity, or weakness. If you're too easy on yourself, you'll become lazy. If you don't push yourself, you'll never achieve anything. Nothing could be further from the truth. Self-compassion is not self-pity. Self-pity says, poor me, everything bad happens to me. Self-compassion says, I am suffering, and that is part of the human experience. Self-compassion is not weakness. It is the strength of tenderness. It is simply treating yourself with the same kindness, the same care, the same understanding you would show to a good friend. Imagine it. If your best friend came to you and told you Hermogenes' story, how he had collapsed, how he had lost everything, what would you say? Would you tell him, you're a failure? You're weak. You deserve it? Or would you say, I am so sorry. You have been through something terrible. It's normal to feel this way. I'm here for you. What do you need? You are not alone. That is self-compassion. It is directing that kind and wise voice inward. Hermogenes had to learn to do this. He had to learn to look at the Hermogenes of the past, the one in the hospital bed, the one who collapsed, not with contempt but with infinite tenderness. He had to embrace that broken man and say, thank you. You did the best you could with the tools you had. And I am here with you now. You are not alone anymore. And this, again, is not poetry. It is pure biology. You see, neuroscience has discovered that our brain has not only a threat system, amygdala, cortisol, and an incentive system, driven by dopamine seeking success, but also a third system, the care and soothing system. This is the system that activates in a mother as she cradles her baby, the one active between supportive friends. It is a system designed for connection, safety, and well-being. And what is the primary neurochemical of this system? Oxytocin. Oxytocin is a marvelous molecule. It's sometimes called the love hormone or the cuddle hormone, but it's so much more. Oxytocin is the natural antidote to cortisol. While cortisol tells us, Danger, fight, flee. Oxytocin tells us, you are safe, you are connected, you can relax, you can heal. And here is the extraordinary part. We have discovered that we don't need someone else to give us that hug to release oxytocin. We can generate it ourselves. When we practice self-compassion, when we speak to ourselves with kindness, when we place a hand on our heart and feel our own pain with acceptance, our brain releases oxytocin. And that oxytocin literally bathes our nervous system and sends a direct signal to the amygdala. Lower your guard. The war is over. Self-compassion, therefore, is not an act of weakness. It is the biological act of shifting from a state of threat to a state of safety. It is the only way to truly heal. Hermogenes began to practice this. And by healing himself from within, by filling his own emptiness, something extraordinary began to happen. He stopped needing. When you live in threat mode, cortisol, or incentive mode, dopamine, you always need something from the outside. You need security, you need validation, you need success, you need the other person to agree with you. But when you live from the care system, from oxytocin, when you nourish yourself, you stop needing and you begin to overflow. And this is where Hermogenes' journey takes its most spectacular turn. This is where the third lesson comes in, generosity. True generosity is not the act of giving what you have left over. True generosity is the outward expression of inner abundance. Hermogenes still had pending legal matters with his former company and his ex-wife. The battle over money, over compensation, was still simmering. It was the last thread tying him to his identity as a victim, to his story of injustice. And one day he made a decision that no one around him could understand. He gave it all up. He renounced all financial compensation, any legal battle. And not only that, he relinquished any financial claims he might have had in his dispute with his ex-wife. He's gone mad, some said. He's surrendered, said others. No, he hadn't surrendered, he had liberated himself. But there was an even deeper reason. His eldest daughter had a dream, to study abroad in the United States, a dream that, given their current family situation, seemed impossible. Hermogenes told me, Mario, I realized that if I continued the war, my children would be the only ones paying the price. If I gave up, if I handed over that money, I wasn't losing it. I was investing it in my daughter's dream. My justice was no longer important. Her future was. Let's analyze this because it is incredibly profound. Our reptilian brain, our amygdala, operates from a place of scarcity. Its motto is, there's not enough. Or, protect what's yours. To the amygdala, generosity is foolish. It is a risk to survival. But the prefrontal cortex, our captain, the seat of our highest values, can operate from abundance. It understands that life is not a zero-sum game. It understands that true power lies not in having, but in being. And that the highest act of being is to give. In making that decision, Hermogenes was doing two things. First, he was shifting from what do I need? Survival, to what can I offer? Meaning and purpose. He found a meaning greater than his own pain, and that, as Viktor Frankl taught us, is the ultimate source of resilience. Second, and this is fascinating, he completely disarmed the enemy. Do you know what happened when he gave everything up to his ex-wife? The war ended. In that instant. She, who was perhaps also operating from fear and scarcity, what will happen to me and my children? Suddenly found there was no one left to fight, nothing left to dispute. Hermogenes' act of generosity broke the cycle of conflict. The external war ended instantly and completely because the internal war within him was already over. Hermogenes had learned the second lesson: self-compassion, self-love, self-forgiveness. And he had learned the third: generosity, giving from a place of fullness. He was no longer just a man free from his resentment. He was now a man free to love, free to create, free to contribute. He was transformed. But what exactly had happened? What do we call this process by which a human being descends into hell, loses everything, and not only survives but emerges stronger, wiser, more compassionate, and freer than before? This isn't just a nice story. Science has a name for this transformation. We had left Hermogenes in a new place, a place of inner freedom forged through forgiveness and self-compassion, a place from which he could perform the supreme act of generosity, letting go of the struggle of the need to be right, and choosing instead love and purpose, embodied in his daughter's future. His journey had been extraordinary. But what exactly had happened to him? If we describe this story to most people, laying out the facts coldly, mental breakdown, hospitalization, job loss, divorce, the word that would come to mind is tragedy, a disaster, the chronicle of a downfall. And yet, one day in the calm of one of our conversations, Hermogenes told me something that struck me to my core. He said, "Mario, when I look back at that dark pit I was in, that indescribable pain, I no longer see it as a problem. I no longer see it as a misfortune." He paused, and with a serenity that only hard-earned wisdom can bring, he said, "Now I look at it, and I see a work of art." How is this possible? How can the most atrocious suffering, the most absolute loss, be perceived as a work of art? In the 20th century, when we began to study the impact of devastating events on the human psyche, we logically focused on the pathology. We developed the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And it is an undeniable reality. PTSD occurs when the trauma is so overwhelming that the brain cannot process it. The person becomes neurologically trapped in the event. That sentinel we've talked about, the amygdala, remains permanently switched on. The captain, the prefrontal cortex, remains disconnected. The person continues to live in a state of war, long after the war has ended. It is a terrible biological prison. But in recent decades, a group of extraordinary psychologists like Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun began to observe a different phenomenon. They noticed that while some people were broken by trauma, others were transformed. They didn't just survive. They weren't just resilient. If we understand resilience as the ability to bounce back to your original shape like a rubber ball, these people did not return to their previous state. They emerged from the trauma different. They emerged with a deeper sense of life, a greater appreciation for simple things, more authentic relationships, a new sense of purpose, and an inner strength they never knew they possessed. Science gave this phenomenon a name: post-traumatic growth, or PTG. Post-traumatic growth is not the denial of pain. It is the consequence of having journeyed through it and integrated it. Hermogenes' story is a textbook case of PTG. But the key question is why? Why does it happen to some people and not others? What is the mechanism that turns poison into medicine, chaos into a work of art? I believe the answer lies in the fundamental difference between being and having, and in the demolition of what we call the false self. You see, most of us construct our identity, our sense of self, from external elements. It is a self based on having. I am my job title. I am my health. I am my role as a father, mother, or spouse. I am my bank account. I am the image I project. Hermogenes, before his collapse, was a master builder of this false self. His identity was his executive position, his status, his ability to control everything. It was a solid, brilliant, admired self, but it was as fragile as a house of cards. And what did the trauma do? What did life do? In one breath, it blew all the cards that defined his self into the air. If he was his job and he was fired, who was he? If he was his role as a husband and he was left, who was he? If he was his health and control and he collapsed, who was he? The trauma didn't just take away what he had, it took away who he thought he was. And this is hell, absolute existential emptiness. When the false self is pulverized, when all external labels disappear, we are left naked before the most terrifying question of all. And now, who am I? In that void there are two paths. One is the path of disintegration, of PTSD, the panic of the amygdala trying to frantically rebuild the false self or remaining paralyzed by the terror of being nothing. But there is another path, the path of post-traumatic growth. It is the path of those who, in that absolute darkness, in that total nakedness, find something that is not outside of them, something that does not depend on what they have. They find their being. They find the part of them that is pure consciousness, the observer who has been there all along. The trauma, by demolishing the facade, by cracking the armor of the false self, paradoxically allows the light of the true self to enter for the first time. Hermogenes, having lost everything he had, was forced to find who he was. And the work of art he speaks of is the work of that reconstruction, no longer of the facade but of an inner home, built on the foundation of the true self. Post-traumatic growth is not automatic. Trauma only provides the opportunity. Growth requires work. And when we analyze Hermogenes' journey, we see that he walked through the three fundamental pillars that science has identified for PTG. The first pillar, forgiveness. As we saw, it is the indispensable condition. Growth is impossible if we remain neurologically chained to the past. The prefrontal cortex cannot design a future if the amygdala is still screaming about the past. Forgiveness was Hermogenes' act of saying, "The war is over. I release the past. I choose the present." It was the act of clearing the scorched earth so something new could be built. The second pillar, generosity and meaning. People who experience PTG almost universally report a new sense of purpose. And this is where Hermogenes' story is so powerful. His act of generosity, giving up the money for his daughter's education, was the moment his personal pain found a transcendent meaning. As Viktor Frankl taught us, a human can bear almost any how, if they have a why. Hermogenes found his why. His suffering was no longer an absurd punishment. It became the price he paid to give a gift of unconditional love. His purpose was no longer his own ego, it was the well-being of another. By finding a meaning greater than his own pain, the pain no longer defined him. And the third pillar, wisdom and self-reflection. Here lies the heart of the artwork. Trauma alone does not bring wisdom. Wisdom comes from the conscious act of processing the trauma. A work of art requires an artist. Hermogenes had to become the artist of his own life. He had to do the painful work of self-reflection. He had to sit in the middle of the rubble of his life, look at each broken piece and ask, what does this teach me? What can I learn from this pain? How can I use this experience to become a better, deeper, more compassionate human being? This is the highest function of our prefrontal cortex. Metacognition, the ability to think about our own thoughts, to observe our own emotions, and to create empowering narratives. Hermogenes actively chose a new narrative. He could have told the story of the victim and he would have been justified. But he chose the narrative of the apprentice, the survivor, the artist. He chose to turn pain into wisdom. He is no longer the Hermogenes of old. It is crucial to understand this. Post-traumatic growth is not about going back to the old self. That person, the false self built on having died in the hospital. The Hermogenes of today is a new man, a Hermogenes 2.0, a man who is more humble because he knows his own fragility, a man who is more compassionate because he knows the taste of suffering, a man who is more authentic because his identity is no longer based on what he has, but on who he is. And ironically, a man who is much, much stronger. Does this mean the wound has disappeared? No. The wound is part of his story. The scar remains. But here is the beauty. At the beginning of his journey, in that question he asked me, he saw his vulnerability, his crack, his flaw as a source of shame. Today that scar is no longer a flaw. That scar is part of the work of art. It is the mark that proves his resilience. It is the evidence of his capacity to heal. It is, as the poet Rumi would say, the place where the light enters. And so, we have journeyed with Hermogenes through his demolition and his extraordinary reconstruction. We have seen how he turned poison into medicine, how he transformed chaos into a work of art. And this brings us naturally back to our starting point. It brings us back to that question he asked me, the question that has been floating in the air since the beginning of our conversation. Mario, is it sensible, is it wise to show our vulnerability, our cracks? After this entire journey, I believe the answer is far deeper than a simple yes or no. What the story of Hermogenes teaches us, what his post-traumatic growth illuminates, is not so much the need to show our vulnerability to the world. That can sometimes be unwise if the environment is not safe. What it teaches us is something infinitely more important. The need to reconcile with our vulnerability. The real journey is not outward. It's not an exhibition. It is a journey inward. It's not about the world accepting our flaws. It's about us ceasing to be at war with them. It's about us accepting them as part of our story, as part of the unique work of art that is our life. And to achieve this reconciliation, we must dismantle the most tragic error in thinking, the most painful cognitive trap that society has instilled in us. The confusion between two words that changes everything. The confusion between the word to be and the word to have. Let me explain, because this is the heart of all human freedom. Our culture, and often our own internal sentinel, has taught us to merge these two words. It has taught us to believe that what we have or what we do defines who we are. And this leads us to a fatal error. We confuse having a flaw with being a flaw. We confuse I made a mistake with I am a mistake. We confuse I failed at this project with I am a failure. We confuse my body has an illness with I am sick. We confuse my marriage has ended with I am unworthy of love. Do you see the difference? Having a flaw, making a mistake, failing at something, these are events. They are actions. They are part of having and doing. They are temporary. They are descriptive of a circumstance. But being a flaw, being a failure, being a mistake, that is an identity. It is a definition of our very being. It is permanent. It is a sentence. When Hermogenes collapsed, his inner judge and the society around him did not say, Hermogenes has a mental health problem. They said, Hermogenes is weak. He is the problem. When he was fired, they didn't say, Hermogenes has lost his job. They said, Hermogenes is a failure. And here is the biological key. When you think you have a problem, your prefrontal cortex activates. It's a challenge. How do I solve this? What resources do I have? What do I need to learn? But when you believe you are the problem, who activates? The sentinel. The amygdala. Because if you are the problem, if you are the mistake, if you are the failure, then your very identity is under threat of annihilation. And to your brain, a threat to your identity is as serious as a threat to your physical survival. And then you enter a state of chronic war, not against the world but against yourself. You become your own enemy. And in that war there can be no healing, only cortisol, inflammation, and more pain. The story of Hermogenes, his journey through forgiveness and generosity, was essentially the journey of unraveling this fatal confusion. He is the perfect example of a man whose entire life was built on having. His false self was defined by, I have a management position. I have a family. I have a home. I have my health. I have control. His life's equation was, what I have equals who I am. And of course, when life, in its sometimes brutal wisdom, took away everything he had, what was the result of his equation? If what I have equals 0, then who I am must also equal 0. This is existential emptiness. This is the hell we spoke of. The feeling of being nothing. But what Hermogenes discovered in that void, what his post-traumatic growth forced him to find, was a truth that changed everything. He discovered his true self. He discovered that there was something in him that was not his job, not his role as a husband, not his health. It was something that could not be fired, something that could not be divorced, something that could not be broken. He discovered his being. And what is this being? It is not something mystical or abstract. It is the most real thing we possess. Our being is our consciousness, the part of us that observes. It is the self that was aware of his success and the very same self that was aware of his pain. Our being is our capacity to choose. Even when he couldn't choose what happened to him, he discovered he could choose how to respond. He could choose forgiveness over anger. He could choose generosity over revenge. Our being is our capacity to love, to feel compassion for himself and for his daughter. Our being is our ability to find meaning. This being is the captain of our ship. And as Hermogenes discovered, a captain's worth is not measured by the calmness of the sea, but by their skill in navigating the storm. And here is the ultimate liberation. Your being has an absolute intrinsic value. Your havings will always fluctuate. It is a world of forms. Today you have health, tomorrow you may not. Today you have a job, tomorrow you could lose it. Today you are in a relationship, tomorrow it could end. That is the nature of life. But your being, your essence, is untouchable. They cannot take away your capacity to love. They cannot divorce you from your ability to choose. An illness cannot touch your consciousness. Your being is the only solid ground on which you can build a life. And this is the conclusion of our journey. The answer to Hermogenes' question is this. We must, above all, make peace with our vulnerability. All of us, every single one of us here has cracks, has scars, has stories of pain, of failure, of fear. Do not let your sentinel, your amygdala, convince you that those scars are you. Do not let your inner critic tell you that you are a failure, that you are a mistake, that you are unworthy. That is the voice of fear. Instead, activate your captain. Use your prefrontal cortex. Look at those scars with compassion as we learn from self-compassion. They are proof of what you have overcome. Learn from them with wisdom as we learn from post-traumatic growth. They are your teachers. And free yourself from their burden through forgiveness as we learned about freedom. Because true freedom, indestructible freedom, is not the absence of problems. It is not having a perfect life. That is an illusion of having. True freedom is the deep peace of knowing that no matter what happens in the world of forms, no matter what happens to what you have, your being will remain intact. As Hermogenes discovered, and as each and every one of us can discover. Until I forgave, I was not free. Thank you very much.